Amidst global outrage over ICE's brutal crackdown in Minneapolis and around the US, agency officials made a shocking announcement about where ICE agents might be headed next. This time, they're going out of the country to Italy for the Winter Olympics. Why is that? So, the BBC has reporting on this wild story emerging from Italy about the US sending ICE agents to the Winter Olympics. Now, an ICE spokesperson said that all security operations remain under Italian authority, but nonetheless, that multiple ICE agents would be traveling with US officials to the events. And understandably, given what ICE has been up to in the US, this has prompted a lot of anger and alarm in Italy. Milan's left leaning mayor said, "This is a militia that kills. Of course, they're not welcome in Milan." It's not unusual for different countries at the Olympics to bring along some of their own security officials to help protect their delegates and other important officials, but ICE has never come to the Olympics before, and there are plenty of other types of security personnel who could be occupying that role instead. This definitely reads as the administration doubling, tripling, quadrupling down on a show of force and an attempt to defend ICE despite global outrage over the atrocities that ICE is currently committing. People in Italy and around the world are watching what has unfolded in Minneapolis, including when Alex Preddy was shot and killed by an ICE agent just this weekend. In fact, the BBC reports that two Italian journalists were threatened by ICE officials as the reporters drove around Minneapolis covering what was happening. The RAI TV report showed one agent warned the crew that if they kept filming the agents, their car windows would be smashed. So, of course, people around the world and in Italy are outraged by this because they're sending their journalists to the US to cover what's happening, and even their journalists are being threatened. Right now, Italy is being governed by an extremely right wing prime minister, Giorgia Meloni, and her opposition has warned that her continued silence on the issue would provide yet more evidence of cowardice and subservience toward Donald Trump. With outrage starting to foment in Italy, its interior minister has since taken an even stronger stance, saying on Monday that ICE will certainly not operate on Italian national territory. And again, the center left mayor of Milan said, "I believe ICE agents shouldn't come to Italy because they don't guarantee they conform to our democratic way of ensuring security." All of this just goes to show how badly the US looks on an international stage, even compared to other right wing governments, because of how brutal and unnecessary these ICE occupations of blue cities throughout the US has clearly become. Here's Minnesota Governor Tim Walz commenting on the state of affairs and the historical parallels it reminds him of.
Our law enforcement continue to do what they do, making Minnesota one of the safest states in the country, one of the best places to live. Allow our children to go back to school. We have got children in Minnesota hiding in their houses, afraid to go outside. Many of us grew up reading that story of Anne Frank. Somebody's going to write that children's story about Minnesota. And there's one person who can end this now. And I'll go back to it again. Please show some decency, pull these folks out, reset this situation, and allow us to do the job that the Attorney General, myself, were elected to do: protect the people of Minnesota and carry out the laws of Minnesota.
Here we have Tim Walz drawing a stark parallel between what's happening in Minnesota now, with children and families too afraid to leave their homes, too afraid to go to school or work or even the grocery store out of fear that they could be brutalized and detained by ICE agents, drawing that parallel to the story of Anne Frank and how a similar story is playing out right now in front of our very eyes in Minnesota. It's stark and it's devastating, and it's clear why even some Republicans have become divided over the massive response to these ICE crackdowns. We have the AP reporting this weekend that after the killing of Alex Preddy, a growing number of Republicans are pressing for a deeper investigation into federal immigration tactics in Minnesota. House Homeland Security Committee Chairman Andrew Garbino sought testimony from leaders at ICE and Border Protection, saying, "My top priority remains keeping Americans safe." A whole host of other congressional Republicans, including Representative Michael McCall of Texas, Tom Tillis of North Carolina, Bill Cassidy of Louisiana, Susan Collins of Maine, and Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, have pressed for more information. Their statements reflect a party struggling with how to respond to Saturday's fatal shooting. At the same time, Trump officials like Kristi Noem were quick to cast Preddy as the instigator in the conflict, but what they're saying does not match the reality of what we can see in video evidence. And this inability for the Trump administration to reflect reality is contributing to this massive surge in anti-ICE sentiment happening in America and beyond. I reported for Wired this weekend that before the 2024 election, polling showed that only around 1 in 4 people supported abolishing ICE. But now, less than 2 years later, but 1 year into Donald Trump's deportation mission, the same polls show 43% of people support abolishing ICE. That is a massive jump forward. This anger is spilling out all over the internet, but it's not confined to social media platforms. This weekend, Republican House Oversight Committee Chairman James Comer suggested that Trump should pull ICE out of Minneapolis, while Fox News hosts and guests said there was no evidence that Preddy was threatening law enforcement at the time he was shot. Even the National Rifle Association and other pro-gun advocacy groups, who are typically pretty closely aligned with Trump, have put out statements calling for a full investigation into Preddy's killing, since he was carrying a weapon at the time. The same party that touts the Second Amendment and gun rights is now claiming that Preddy was at fault for having a gun legally on his person at the time of the shooting. This cognitive dissonance has just become too much. And even if the hypocrisy is the point, Americans and people around the world can see it. The Wall Street Journal reports that even the lawyer for the agent who shot Renee Good a few weeks back in Minneapolis thinks ICE has gone too far. He's a GOP candidate named Chris Medell. He's representing ICE agent Jonathan Ross, and he just dropped out of the Minnesota governor's race, saying national Republicans have made it nearly impossible. Meanwhile, the AP is reporting that the chief federal judge in Minnesota says that the Trump administration has failed to comply with orders to hold hearings for detained immigrants, and he's ordered the head of ICE to appear before him this Friday to explain why he shouldn't be held in contempt of court. It's obvious that the Republican Party has lost any foothold it may have had, for sure in Minneapolis, already a very blue city, but also around the state, as people there are grappling with the impacts of this ICE occupation. But it's not just Minnesota. Traction on these viewpoints is spreading far and wide. And Trump and his administration are responding like they always do: deflect, distract, and undermine the credibility of your political enemies. Trump posted on Monday that he was instructing the Department of Justice to look into Minnesota Representative Ilhan Omar, claiming that there was something fraudulent about her net worth, as usual, with no evidence whatsoever. But Ilhan Omar responded, "Sorry, Trump, your support is collapsing and you're panicking. Right on cue, you're deflecting from your failures with lies and conspiracy theories about me. Years of investigations have found nothing. Get your goons out of Minnesota." And while it seems like ICE's resolve in Minnesota is fading fast, the agency has already set its sights on other US cities. One of those places is Portland, Maine. The Guardian reports that after spending just days in Maine, ICE has already arrested hundreds of people. The DHS Assistant Secretary of Public Affairs, Tricia McLaughlin, is saying that those people are the worst of the worst who have been charged and convicted of horrific crimes. But the AP took a closer look at some of those case files and found that the worst of the worst propaganda is not true whatsoever. For example, they highlight the case of Elmara Correa, an Angola native who ICE highlighted, saying she was arrested previously for endangering the welfare of a child. Maine court records show that the reality is a case with a person of that name was later dismissed, and that it had to do with learner's permits for new drivers, not the horrific child abuse that you may have been imagining. Now, Korea filed a petition on Wednesday challenging her detention, and a judge issued a temporary emergency order barring authorities from transferring her from Massachusetts, where she's currently being held. Her attorney said she entered the US legally on a student visa about 8 years ago and has never been subject to expedited removal proceedings before. Portland's mayor said during a news conference that he had concerns over ICE failing to distinguish between arrests and convictions or even explain whether sentences were served. He pointed to another person named in ICE's press release, Danny Lopez Cortez. ICE referred to him as a criminal illegal alien from Guatemala who was convicted of operating under the influence. However, the mayor questioned whether an operating under the influence conviction, which is a serious offense but a very common one in Maine, should really rise to the level of the worst public narrative. Boston immigration attorney Caitlin Burgess said her office filed habeas petitions Thursday on behalf of 4 clients who were detained in Maine and transferred to Massachusetts. The most serious charge any of them faced was driving without a license, and all of them had pending immigration court cases or applications. Of her clients, attorney Samantha McHugh said none of these individuals have any criminal record. They were simply at work eating lunch when unmarked vehicles arrived and immigration agents trespassed on private property to detain them. This is very similar to the cases we've seen of ICE detainment and brutalization happening all over the country. The people who ICE is going after are not the worst of the worst criminals. They're our neighbors who have been demonized with racist propaganda. And ICE itself is breaking the law repeatedly, causing real crime and terror in these communities in an effort to supposedly make Americans safer, when in reality, ICE is the one making Americans unsafe. Lest we forget, 2 American citizens in Minneapolis have been killed by ICE in just the past few weeks. Nobody deserves this type of treatment, regardless of immigration status or previous crimes committed. This is not the way that we should be treating our neighbors. It doesn't contribute to public safety, it actually contributes to public terror. And there's even another sinister purpose behind all of this. Local Maine news outlet News Center Maine reported that Maine's Secretary of State, Shenna Bellows, rejects what she's referring to as a ransom for ICE agents to leave the state. Now, previously, U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi wrote to Minnesota Governor Tim Walz urging him to take certain steps to end the chaos in Minnesota, including turning over all of Minnesota's records on Medicaid, SNAP, and other food and nutrition service programs to federal fraud investigators, repealing sanctuary policies, and crucially, allowing the Civil Rights Division of the DOJ to access state voter rolls. Tim Walz declined these requests, and so did the Minnesota Secretary of State, writing, "The answer to Attorney General Bondi's request is no. As Maine's top election official, I stand with Minnesota Secretary of State Steve Simon." Maine's top election officials have similarly said no. Shenna Bellows specifically said, "The Attorney General's letter to Minnesota makes it very clear that ICE is invading Minnesota and Maine to create chaos and to control our states and our elections. Let me say this very clearly for President Trump and Attorney General Bondi. Maine will never turn over our voter rolls as a ransom payment to get ICE out of our state." The idea that immigrants are terrorizing American communities just isn't true. And in fact, the opposite is the case. ICE is terrorizing American communities as part of a plot to manipulate and inform the next elections. Republicans know how unpopular Trump's administration has been thus far, and they know the only way to stop the midterms from swinging so heavily in favor of blue candidates is to stop people from voting, period. Imagine in a few months if ICE patrols are happening outside of major polling locations that could have an enormous impact on the future of politics in this country. That would be voter suppression and manipulation, and it's a tactic that the Trump administration is not above. That's what these blue state officials are recognizing now, and they're not the only ones. People around the country and around the world have had enough of ICE. They want ICE abolished, they want ICE agents removed, and they want this immigration crackdown to stop. It serves no purpose other than to further divide our communities and go after some of our most vulnerable but essential neighbors. Going back to the top of this story, sending ICE agents to Italy of all places is going to do nothing to help matters. A show of force at this stage, tripling and quadrupling down on what's happening, is just going to make everything worse. People in Italy don't want to see ICE agents in their country. People around the world are sick of the Trump administration and ICE, and Americans are increasingly turning out en masse to protest what's happening here. Everything that happened in Minneapolis this weekend and what's happening in Maine now is just further proof of that.